Hello, everybody. I'm Tom Ketchkamethi at the American Academy of Philadelphia, the American Academy of Political and Social Science here in Philadelphia. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the third webinar in our Democracy in the Balance series. This series is a collaboration of our Academy and the American Democracy Collaborative, which is a cross-institutional scholarly initiative examining the state of American democracy through history and comparative studies, and the Einaudi Center at Cornell University. The impetus for this series of webinars was the publication of a volume of our journal, and I have my first hard copy as of just a few days ago, the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science on democratic vulnerability and resilience in the United States. The special editors of that volume were political scientists Suzanne Mettler and Tom Popinski of Cornell, and Robert Lieberman of Johns Hopkins. All of the contents of that volume are free and open to read right now. And you can go to ann.sagepub.com to see it, or you can just drop me a note at thomask@upenn.edu and I will get you there. Suzanne Mettler and Rob Lieberman have been our partners in crime in bringing this webinar series together. So a very special thanks to them. You don't see them on camera, and you won't today, but they've been really the substantive engines behind all of this. The first webinar in this series that we did focused on democratic vulnerabilities and sources of resilience in the United States. And the second webinar took a look at what the United States may have to learn from other countries that are currently dealing with rising polarization, authoritarianism, and democratic backsliding. In this final installment, we're going to turn our attention to opportunities for reform in the United States and more productive ways for liberal democratic ethos to be forwarded in our broader body politic. I'm very, very pleased that Jelani Cobb agreed to be our moderator and guide for today's conversation. Jelani is an historian, journalist, essayist, and writer who's currently a staff writer at The New Yorker and a professor at the Columbia University School of Journalism. He does as much as any contemporary writer to incorporate historical perspectives and a broad understanding of contemporary society into discussions of politics. And it's his kind of encompassing thinking that we need more of just generally. So Jelani, thanks for doing this. And with him, we have a distinguished group of 4 panelists. We have a state-based elections practitioner in Judd Choate, who's the director of the Division of Elections for the Colorado Department of State. He's a lawyer and also a self-described recovering political scientist. We have Larry Jacobs, who is one of our nation's most prolific and authoritative scholarly voices on American democracy. Larry's a political scientist and professor at the University of Minnesota, where he directs the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance. Hahrie is a political scientist at Johns Hopkins University, who is really our nation's leading scholar of political movements, collective action, and organizing, especially as they apply to the revitalization of American democracy and democratically adjacent social movements. And Lee Drutman is a senior fellow in the Political Reform Program at New America. In his life as a political scientist, Lee is an empiricist who's done extensive work on American political system, on the American political system and its vulnerabilities vis-a-vis democracy. But he's also a public intellectual and podcast host who does a great deal to make the work of political science resonate in the public square. Today's session is going to run about 75 minutes, and we'll be reserving the last 15 minutes for audience questions. So you can use the Q&A function at any time to post your questions. We'll be monitoring them. We hope to be able to get to many of them in the last 15 minutes. And with that, I'll turn things over to Jelani Cobb. Thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you, Tom. And I have to say that as a sole historian surrounded by political scientists, I seem to have fallen in with a bad crowd And so I'm very happy to be able to talk with all of you this afternoon. I think that you all bring, very dynamic and fascinating perspectives. We'll see if we can hold to our objective of solving the world's problems in the next hour. I want to start with a question, a kind of 30,000-foot question. And we can go in the order that you all appear on my screen, which I know is not the same order as you all appear on your own screens, but that would be Hahrie, Lee, Larry, and then Judd. Let's start with a fundamental question. Do you agree with the contention that democracy in the United States is in decline? And if so, how? And what are the most effective mechanisms or points of intervention in order to arrest that phenomenon?
Well, I'll jump in and start. So I just want to start by saying thank you to everyone for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, which I'm sure will be really robust, and I'm sure we'll end with having solved all the problems. So I'm looking forward to that too. So to start with that question, so I think one thing we have to remember is that democracy is constantly in formation. And I think that's been true throughout American history. It continues to be true now. So there's no static end state throughout history in which democracy is done. And I don't expect that we'll ever be at that end state either. So I think it is true that we are in a moment of deep formation right now, that there's probably more flux and dynamism in the system now. But I worry sometimes when we sort of talk about the crisis of democracy and forget that there's never been a point really where we've been able to achieve the ideals of democracy as they've been originally laid out. And so I think we are in this moment right now of uncertainty, where it's not clear exactly what directions our democracy will go. But the piece of that I wanted to talk about is this idea that democracy in the end, I think, doesn't work unless the public buys into it. And the crisis that I worry about the most is the idea that there's so much disaffection right now from democracy itself as a solution to some of the problems that we see. So coming out of the 2020 election, looking at everything that's going on right now, I think one of the things we see is that our political institutions really are under threat in really important ways. I'm sure we'll talk more about that later today. But one of the things I think that I worry about is that sometimes when we talk about institutional reform, it feels like it's playing whack-a-mole, right? That, all these actors are trying to use political institutions for their own end. And when you have a situation where some portion of those actors are using them for anti-democratic ends, you're constantly trying to stamp out what the problems are. And so that's part of the reason why I think the public commitment to democracy really matters, because in the end, any institutional reform we make is going to depend on how people use it. People are always going to use the institutions for their own strategic ends. And so really a safeguard between a crisis of democracy or a moment of uncertainty in democracy that we're in right now and the actual decline of it is really the public. And so when I think about the kind of public disaffection, then the thing that I worry about is sometimes, we're in this moment where people don't necessarily feel like democracy is a solution to the most concrete problems they face in their lives. Democracy is a unique form of government in the sense that it demands that people accept uncertainty over outcomes in order to have some kind of process that they can believe in. But right now, people feel like the choice that they have before them kind of stinks, right? The problems aren't being solved, the outcomes are terrible, and most people feel like they can't do anything about it. Voting is obviously the closest mechanism that people have to be able to do about it. But the other part of the solution is to try to think about how can we recreate opportunities for people to put their hands in the levers of change. And so that's where I think the ways in which people are invited to participate in public life, that includes, but is not only through elections, becomes a really crucial part of the conversation that we have to have. And so, I think that in thinking about the role that civil society, that movements, that political parties, that all of these institutions can play in building this reform depends on recreating opportunities where people are able to engage in these institutions. That's not just about expressing their outrage, but actually trying to negotiate for political power. And that's, I think, the piece that we've historically lost that I hope that we can begin to rebuild.
Can I ask you one quick thing as a follow-up?
Yeah.
Is the disaffection that we've seen the logical response to institutional behavior that has been in need of reform for many, many years?
Well, it's a good question in the sense of like, you know, in terms of like, I think it depends on how you define logical, I guess, in a way is one way of thinking about it. But I guess what I would say is that, you know, basically what democracy is asking people to do is to say, look, I don't know if my side is going to win or not, right? I don't know if I'm going to be able to, you know, if the candidate, if the policies that I want are going to win, but I want you to be able to buy into the system and say, without knowing whether or not your side is going to win, we think this is the best way to govern ourselves, right? And when the outcomes that we're asking people to accept are too broad, right? When people feel like there's a possibility they may not be able to feed their family, when parents feel like their children's lives are not going to be as good as their lives, like I think when you have that kind of uncertainty, then it is not illogical for people to say, hey, the system isn't working, right? The system that you're asking me to buy into is not working. And so in a sense that, you know, is it a logical response? I certainly don't think it's illogical. Like I think there's a legitimacy to people's sense that if the system isn't working, then why should I buy into it? And so that's why I think the solutions that we have to talk about have to be both about, you know, how do we get to a, you know, thinking questions about inequality and injustice, and how do we get to a place where the outcomes aren't so terrible themselves, which is part of the process, but then also how do people then begin to feel like they can have say in what those outcomes are, right? Because when people feel like they have say, then that sense that you're asking me to accept something that I can't accept is not as big.
Lee, can you respond to the first question about the nature of the problem and potential areas of addressing it?
Absolutely. And I'm really delighted and honored to be part of such a distinguished group. And I want to build here on what Hahrie was saying about democracy being a fragile pact, that we have to all accept that there are periodic elections in which the candidates and parties that we support may not win. Democracy is a system in which parties lose election, in which losers concede and winners act with grace. And clearly, we are not seeing that right now. And part of that is because the stakes are too damn high. And you know, this is part of why everybody feels so powerless, because so much of the focus and the attention is on Washington and who has power in the White House and in Congress, and really far away from most people. And so much of our politics has been nationalized. So much of our politics is organized around these symbolic culture war issues that are actually quite distant from a lot of people's lives. And, you know, so really there are, you know, I mean, I think Hahrie is absolutely right that democracy is not a system to perfect. It's a system in which we govern ourselves and agree to disagree productively. And you know, I think Hahrie's points about the negotiation and compromise as part of democracy are incredibly important. But the way that our politics is operating in this hyper-partisan binary style in which most people are surrounded by like-minded people. Democrats live in cities and dense suburbs. Republicans live in exurbs and small towns. Everybody's in an echo chamber where they're sure that they're right and the other side is the enemy. The other side is un-American. The other side is a threat to America. You know, that is a fundamental challenge to this foundational premise of democracy as a system in which parties can lose elections. So this is the problem of hyper-partisan polarization. And then there's, I think, a second problem, which is that the Republican Party has become a liberal party. And there is no penalty for that, because in a moment of hyper-partisan polarization, there are not enough voters who are willing to vote for the Democratic Party on the grounds of the Republican Party isn't a liberal party. And I mean, for most people, you know, who knows what the processes of democracy are even supposed to be. So this creates a tremendous crisis when you have a political system in which democracy depends on one party winning elections. And I do feel like it depends on the Democratic Party winning elections. You actually don't have a democracy really anymore. So the fundamental challenge in this moment is, what do you do about the illiberal takeover of the Republican Party? And I mean, my view is we need more than two parties. We have to, the two-party system isn't working. The two-party system as it is organized now is actually an aberration from the American political tradition, which has long had many parties within the two-party system. And what we have now is actually a distinct, unique moment. And that's not going to change by itself. We're in what I've called the doom loop, which is an escalating moment of hyper-partisanship, arms race, demonization, and constitutional hardball. And the only way we're going to get out of it is through more parties. Now, it's a hard thing to do in the two-party single member district system, but a few signs of hope. I'm watching with great interest what's going to happen this Saturday at the Utah Democratic Convention, which is not something that people usually spend a lot of time watching. But if the Utah Democrats nominate none of the above, it means that Evan McMullin will have a very good shot at winning the Senate seat in Utah. Now, Mike Lee, we've seen quite a bit about Mike Lee in the news recently and his role in supporting and abetting the attempted coup, and then then trying to kind of wiggle out of it. Now, if you run that playbook in a number of states and districts, you can start to elect some moderate independent third-party candidates. Another thing I'm excited about, there's some efforts in New Jersey to introduce ballot fusion, which would create a moderate party that could nominate somebody like Tom Malinowski and give moderate Republicans an opportunity to vote for a more moderate candidate without having to vote for the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is toxic for a lot of people in this country. So this is fusion. Longer term, I think what we need is proportional representation that would allow multiple parties to flourish. But I think we need to focus on building parties. Parties are the essential institutions of modern mass democracy. They're what connects citizens to government. And we need to. The stakes are too damn high. And I think one of the challenges, and Hahrie noted this, is that people feel like their choices are all crap. They vote for Democrats or they vote for Republicans, nothing changes. There's very little leverage for voters in a two-party system, especially a two-party system in which 90% of congressional districts are safe for one party and 80% of states are safe for one party.
Lee, you and I have had conversations about this previously. We had a long discussion about the way in which political parties have collapsed in American history previously.
That's right.
And the question I have for you about this, though, is what we've seen. Part of one of the dynamics that at play here is the phenomenal level of organization and alignment that parties have been able to achieve. And the level of uniformity, even if we're looking at a kind of telltale issue like abortion, between Democrats feel one way, Republicans feel another way, and that's just the way it is. Having seen how effective the parties have been at creating not just kind of policy alignments with their constituencies, but identities that are aligned with their constituencies. How do you get from that to a system in which we have decentered parties or the two main parties, and that we have a more viable multi-party system in American democracy?
Well, I think that there are actually tremendous fractures within both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party at this point, as well as a lot of voters who feel unrepresented by either party because they have idiosyncratic or off-dimensional coalitions. So, I mean, it's true that the Democratic Party is more homogenous than it's ever been, but it's still a messy Big Tent party in which there are tremendous fights between the progressives and the sort of moderate, corporate Democrats. So I mean, I think the multiple parties exist in waiting, but right now they're making these coalitions within the Democratic Party, and what the Democratic Party and the Republican Party both do when it comes around election time is they say, well, you may disagree with us on such and such issues, or you may think we're not progressive enough, or we're too, we're too progressive, but the Republicans,
I
they're
think
the
you're
threat
saying
to democracy.
too woke is the pejorative that
Yes.
they would use for
Too
that.
woke, right? But the Republicans, they're going to destroy democracy. So you got to step it up and vote for the woke Democrats. Or on the Republican side, Democrats are going to turn America into this socialist camp in which all the white working class people will be sent into re-education camps, and so whatever you disagree with the Republicans on tax policy, the Democrats get in charge. They'll take away your guns and force you off to Maoist struggle sessions or whatever.
Larry, can I ask you the original question as well?
Yeah, well, first, again, it's good to be with all of you. I'm a little concerned about using words like doom and no democracy. I agree with Hahrie. I think we're looking at a long history of contested fights. There's been, I'm not a big cycles fan of thinking about things, but certainly there's been pitched battles. And I don't think I need to review the blood that's been spilled over democracy, civil rights, and rights, and I think rights about policing. I mean, this is part of a long history. So I prefer not to kind of go to the extremes on this. I do think there are things about this moment that when we say contested, it doesn't mean it's all bad. We just came out of a presidential election that set a record for participation during a pandemic, during a time when there was, really unfortunate, efforts to undermine that. People voted, and they voted in record numbers. That was an extraordinary thing. I think the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the associated efforts, again, this is an extraordinary moment. Hahrie has written a terrific book and continues to do research on community grassroots organizing that points to the vibrancy and the opportunities and the challenges of mobilizing and positioning marginalized groups to be self-organizing. And I think that's also very hopeful. And there are patterns of this, over our history. It's not just kind of we're a bunch of losers and our democracy is going down the drain. People want democracy. They want voice and they want results. And this has been a constant. So, I think there are things about this moment. I'd also add, we're about a dozen years into the Affordable Care Act, which, was passed in the midst of this dreary period that we're hearing described. Well, it's now covering 30 million people, and all the efforts to declare it unconstitutional, all the efforts to repeal it didn't work. And, I think it's on a path where it will become the dominant form of insurance in time. But at this point, what we're seeing is really, in my view, an irreversible process of it spreading expectations for coverage. And as it does that, it's changing the politics around healthcare. It's also an opportunity eventually to, I think, alter the way people see government. And so this sense of government doesn't, is not there and it's not solving problems. That's less true on healthcare, as it is with regards to Social Security, which started out very similar ways. There were efforts to repeal Social Security, and now we've got 80 or 90% supporting it, and I don't see any risk of that going away. I do think, we haven't talked about the information system, which would be both the media, but also social media and other forms of information. We just came through a year in which I see the dominant coverage of what the Democrats were doing with historically narrow margins focused on screw ups. You know, he couldn't pass Build Back Better. Well, there were a bunch of us saying, you know, that was probably far too ambitious given the election results in 2020. But this is front page news, and it sent a message of incompetence and division rather than, you know, just the normal story about how legislation goes through the conflict, the push and pull. And it's quite possible we'll get something. It'll be much less, but that is what, you know, again, a bunch of us were predicting soon after the election. This was not going to be an FDR moment. And, you know, I think there were media, particularly in the left, that created that false expectation. In terms of the problem, I think the problem is we need to pay a lot more attention to the durability of our democratic procedures and rules. We tend to like to go to kind of, you know, what I think of as like the Olympic figure skating. Who can come up with the most dazzling idea for reform? And even though it's not going to happen, or it's very unlikely to happen because of the structure of the Constitution and the politics around constitutional reform. And here's, I think, a primary example of what I'm talking about. I agree with Lee that the Republican Party is a dangerous party at this point. But I would ask, what is that party? And what's clearly happened is that the primary system has allowed a small number of ideologues to get control over nomination. And that's a big part of the problem. If you go back to 2015, when Donald Trump announced, after coming down the escalator, that he was going to be a presidential candidate, you saw in pretty quick order leaders of the Republican Party, not everyone, but just about everybody, coming out and saying in different ways he was unfit. And then as he started to run, it became very clear that he had disdain for the Constitution, had a very loose grasp of what rule by law means, that the norms of discourse and conduct were so far away from what most of us embrace, including Republicans, that he surely was not appropriate or fit to be president. But there was nothing the Republican Party could do. There were 17 candidates. He won about a third, and he was able to emerge as the nominee. And once the candidate emerges as a nominee in the primary process, nothing leadership can do because it's locked down by this primary system that we've adopted over the last half century. You know, some people say, oh, wait a second, primaries are the voice of the people. Not really. A quarter to a third participate in presidential election years, which is like Democratic, carnival. In the midterm elections, it's about half that. Some very important elections, such as the election of the Tea Party in 2010, that in some ways set us on a trajectory that we're now in. Turnout in a lot of those Tea Party elections was like 12%, 15%. AOC had 12% turnout of Democrats and defeated in that primary a very important rising Democrat in Congress who may have become speaker. So my point is that the procedures by which we nominate our candidates has been very poorly designed and redesigned. And I think we need to pay a lot more attention to these procedures because it's our lack of attention to the democratic rules that is opening the door to a whole array of demagogues, of ideologues who are being supported by a small number who tend to be more ideological. And that's certainly more true among Republicans than Democrats, but also somewhat true among Democrats. I think there are reforms we can do. These are not going to win the figure skating Olympics, but I think they're very important. They're concrete, they're doable. One is we need to have a vigorous conversation about democracy. The idea that primaries are democratic is nonsense. It is the opposite of that. All the problems that we've talked about today have some, origin or some tie-in to a primary system that's been taken over by a small number of renegades. So I think we need to take a hard look, starting with the role of superdelegates in the Democratic Party and unpledged delegates in the Republican Party. In the academy, we're all familiar with peer review. Well, that's what this is. It's peer review. And some people say, well, wait a second. Just going to give power to the old party corrupt machine? I don't think that actually fits with what we know about political parties in a competitive process. Median voter theory, it's been around for a long time. Its main prediction is that parties, it was not an argument about candidates, by the way, that parties would tend to converge toward the midpoint of public opinion in order to win the election. And that is the dynamic of party leaders when they're in a kind of healthy party system and a two-party system that we have. I think we also need to take a look at our system of administering elections. It tends to be taken for granted, but it is the backbone of our election process. And you can look at Donald Trump's conduct in 2020, and all of us were appalled by what he did and continues to do. But let's look at what didn't happen. Here you had the President of the United States launching a full assault on our electoral process. And for the most part, with one or two exceptions, including in Colorado, we saw that system hold. And we saw even Republican secretaries of state, like Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, follow the rules, follow the laws, and judges came along, over 90 of them, and a bunch of them nominated by Republicans and Trump come along and confirm that. So that's an example of this kind of infrastructure that we have that I think really needs to be given great attention. That is part of our system for restraining elites. That's the number one problem we have right now, are out of control elites. The second part, I very much agree with Hahrie Hahn, that we need to be looking for ways to not only engage citizens, but find ways in which citizens become a more visible and forceful element of our decision-making. So they have a say, they have a voice. And I think it's really important. This book I just wrote, Democracy Under Fire, Donald Trump and the Breaking of American History. It starts with this incredible story in the 1780s of newly empowered citizens who took the Declaration to heart and got organized. You had farmers and laborers running for office for the first time. And then they got elected, and the people who organized around them gave them instructions and became, part of the process for the laws that they passed. And that encouraged really a very positive kind of elements of strong democracy. And I think we can get back to that. And I think the work that Harrie's been doing is so important and really charting that direction.
Okay, Larry, let me give you some pushback here. There's a contention that Donald Trump, who was a serial failure in business, in multiple enterprises, was never distinguished by his competence, that we owe the continued existence of our system in the way that it does, not to any particular durability of the system, but to the ineptitude of the person who was attempting to undermine it. I think that we could make a fairly good history of the Trump era by using solely as a primary source open letters published by institutional leaders. We saw over the course of that presidency, former secretaries of state, military figures. I forget who in the administration went so far as to assure the Russians that we weren't going to launch any attacks in the last days. We saw so many astounding events that we were looking in the thesaurus to find another word for unprecedented, because we had used it so often. Now, of course, now these things, I agree with your contention that not all these things that we called unprecedented actually were, but does that mean that they were any less dangerous?
I think Donald Trump was the most dangerous president we ever had. I agree with everything you said. My point is he should never have been nominated. And it's because we don't pay attention enough to our democratic procedures and rules. Why do we have a process for nominating candidates that allows such a small clique to put forward a guy like Donald Trump, even though virtually the entire leadership of his party was opposed to him? That's the core question. Why did that happen? And, you know, a lot of people would go back to the Democratic reforms after the 1968 election, and they'd point to the so-called Mcgovern Commission. Well, I spent a lot of time, you know, studying that and talking to folks around that. And, you know, that was a sellout. George McGovern, you know, I think he was an honorable person, but, you know, the record is really clear. He wanted to run for president. He couldn't run for president with the Democratic Party in place. And he signed on to a set of reforms that blew up or accelerated the demise of the Democratic Party. There were a lot of other directions to have gone with that. And those who say, wait a second, you know, McGovern was just following the 1968 Chicago riots, that's not nonsense. The SDS and others were talking about a genuine democratic revolution. They were not talking about the kind of Byzantine institutional process that McGovern set up. So I think the focus we really need to have here is on our institutions. We need to look at those procedures. We need to be asking, do we want to allow a small number of party activists and interest groups and allies to determine who the nominee is? Because that is the election. And if it's true that, you know, we're going to have 90% of the congressional seats safe after the courts get done, well, it's the only election that matters. And it's particularly the case in presidential elections. If you win the nomination, you're guaranteed virtually all of your partisans when it comes time to the general election, because it'll be a head-to-head match between a Democrat and a Republican. And usually, you know, the partisans in each side will rally up behind their candidate, even though they may be very dangerous in the case of Donald Trump.
Judd, I know we've gone through several iterations, but I want to ask you at least the first version of that question about, you know, the extent to which it's accurate to say that our democracy is in decline, and what we should be doing to intervene.
Thank you, Jelani. First, thanks to the American Democracy Collaborative for inviting me. I watch a lot of these. You rarely have a practitioner. We don't really fit into the square, or we're the square peg that doesn't quite fit. But I really appreciate it. I think it's always a good idea to actually have somebody that does the work of democracy in a democracy conversation. Is democracy dying or in decline? I don't think so. I think that it has a cold. I think it's under the weather, but I don't think it's dying. The real way to think about this is we actually have a number of different data points that we can point to that can give you a broad understanding of where democracy is and how people feel about their democracy. So I'll do sort of a more reductionist kind of analysis and point you to, we had 66.8% turnout among eligible voters. That's not registered voters, but eligible voters. So over 2/3 of the people who could have voted in the 2020 election did vote. That was the national percentage, and that includes Oklahoma and Wyoming and Idaho and states that do historically very low percentages, Hawaii, which has very low typical turnout. And so even when taking account of states that don't typically do very well, we still had over 2/3 of the eligible voters voting in that election. We also, by the way, Larry represents Minnesota. Minnesota had 80% of eligible voters voting in that election, 80% of eligible. So that's well over 90% of registered voters. It's really hard to get around the idea that people were very engaged in their democracy in the 2020 election. Now, you know, we can fight about who the candidates were and whether they were very representative of the ideals of those people. But at the end of the day, they participated at a record number. No, we haven't seen that level of turnout for 120 years. And frankly, the nature of the electorate now, given the expansion of the electorate over the last 50 to 60 years, is substantially different than it was 120 years ago. And the diversity of our population is frankly something that makes turnout harder. And but yet we had an extraordinary turnout in 2020. So that's a really good indication that people are engaged in their democracy. We also have the highest percentage registered to vote in the history of this country. We have 6 states that have over 90% of their eligible population registered to vote. Colorado has 93% of their eligible population registered to vote. That means if I go with a clipboard and stand on the corner downtown in Denver, Colorado on 16th Street, I'm unlikely to find anybody that I can register to vote. I might get a couple of people that I can update, but I can't find anybody to register because they simply don't exist. They are hiding from us. We've done everything we can to get them registered, just like a number of states have. So we have a very high level of engagement. We have a high level of people interested enough to become registered and be eligible to vote in a given election. But we also have these sort of more minor indicators. We have a great attention from watchers and observers. Now, some of this is sort of a worrisome outcome of the election denier crowd that has arisen out of the 2020 election. But you know what? They're engaged electorates and people that want to know more about the work that elections administrators do. And while it's worrisome in one respect, that's also a really good thing, because if I can get people in a room and show them how an election is run and show them how we use the equipment and how the software works, I'm in much better position to show them that it's actually honest and that we can prove that it's honest because we do post-election audits. By the way, in 2016, fewer than half of the states in the country did post-election audits. Now, well over 3/4 of the states in the country have post-election audits. So we have another fact to be able to demonstrate that the election was fairly run and that people can believe in the outcome. And then we also have these sort of smaller outgrowths that are happening around the country, which actually speak largely to what Lee was talking about earlier, which is that there are instant runoff states. Maine is now an instant runoff state. Alaska has adopted instant runoff. By the way, this is, people know this as ranked choice voting. It's ranked choice voting. It's not actually a especially good term. It's an instant runoff election. So Maine and Alaska have adopted that. A number of smaller jurisdictions have adopted that. This is clearly a move toward a democratic reform. This is a democratic reform angling toward this idea of adopting more centrist or broadly viewed perspectives on the electorate and having candidates that represent that group. So while it's not a third party, it is a more representative set of those that represent the major two parties. So it's there are all these sort of incremental improvements that are happening while at the same time this storm is happening. You know, we all have our attention riveted on the storm, but at the elections administration level, there are many great indicators that democracy is working.
Okay, Judd, I'm going to push back and give you the counter supposition as well. We saw in the last election workers who had to go into hiding. We have also seen the state legislatures stripping authority from those very secretaries of state that we saw who went against their trend, very often going against their party. We've also seen large majorities, particularly in the Republican side, large majorities of people who believe that the election was unfairly handled. And I'm not sure that voting is the sole barometer that we can rely on for the the safety and health of democracy, saying the person who has great blood pressure might also still have cancer. And so the concern I have here is, what do these other things add up to? Or are we kind of whistling past the graveyard here?
Well, those are fair points, and that's why I would certainly agree
Actually,
with you.
also, one last thing, the legislation on voting access, which we've seen sweep across the country, which people in the civil rights community are extremely alarmed about, thinking that it will have a chilling effect on the turnout in those communities as well.
Yeah, so I agree with you. That's why I said that democracy has a cold. It's a bit under the weather. And I think that some of the things you identify there are certainly indications that we have problems. The laws passed in Texas, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and other states, Wisconsin, are really worrisome. And in some respects, really dismantle many of the protections that Larry was talking about and in a very worrisome way. Interestingly, though, a number of other states continue on the road toward progress, toward more liberal reforms, liberal in the small L way.
Democratic, right? Sense, right?
Yeah. So it's not all gloom and doom. And I would say, just to speak to your point about elections officials, I have received over 60 death threats. I've worked with the FBI on the threats that I've received. They have pursued people who have made those threats to me personally. Mm-hmm. And I live in a state where Joe Biden won by 15% and 400,000 voters. So yes, that problem exists, and it is very worrisome. But the underlying dynamics are good. And what we probably are pointing to is that so many states are going this way and so many states are going that way, that at some point the federal government's going to have to reorganize the way that we do our elections and sort of create a new starting point. And that's what they did in 1964, 1965 with Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. That's what they did with HAVA in 2002. That's what they did with MOVE in 2009. They create these marks in time where they say, hey, everybody's doing this differently. We don't like that. We're going to reset where everybody's at. And we almost got there this year with Senate Bill 1 and House Bill 1, the two bills that were strongly considered. And I think if the two Democrats, sort of holdout Democrats that were unwilling to do away with filibuster, if they had broken, they very likely that bill would have passed and would have been signed by the president. So we were pretty close. And that's probably what we need to do as a nation, to sort of reset this stuff. But, that'll come, and it'll probably come when enough people get frustrated, probably Democratic voters in Republican states, to bring about enough change that they can sway that group to get us to enough votes to make that kind of sort of orienting kind of legislative change.
So can we come to a middle ground here and say democracy has a cold, but we're still awaiting the results of the COVID test?
That's right. That is fair.
And I'm not sure we have vaccines yet.
I'm not sure. This is the early 2020 version of waiting for those results to come back. We have used a lot of time on this question, which I think got at a lot of other things. But if we can go in the reverse order, that would be Judd, Larry, Lee, and Hahrie. Could we just, in kind of capsule, responses, what did the last election, and you've kind of touched on some of this, what did the last election teach us about opportunities for reform?
Again, I think there is a real cleave that's happening in the U.S. elections. There are reform states, and then there are non-reform states, and there are sort of retrenching states, honestly. And the number breakdown on those will become more and more notable in their percentage turnout, percentage engagement. And I really think what 2020 sort of demonstrated was that there is a real interest in running for election. There's real interest in being engaged in elections. There's a real interest in people becoming prepared to be in an election. Again, like Larry said, we were in the middle of a pandemic. In fact, during the primary season, which more people voted in the primaries and participated in the caucuses than had ever done that before. That was in the worst part of the pandemic, where nobody would leave their houses, but yet we still had extraordinary engagement. So there are all these indicators that suggest really good things. But at the same time, the two parties sort of have set up a dynamic where they are pretty oppositional right now, and in a way that doesn't really promote democratic reforms. And I think what will likely have to happen is we'll need to get to a point where enough people who are either elected Republicans or enough people in states where there are typically elected Republicans elect Democrats to be able to do a more national change to that dynamic. Because in our current status, we're sort of set on two different trajectories, where states like Minnesota and Colorado and others will continue to do really exciting things to expand democracy, and other states will do things to make it more and more difficult to vote.
Mm-hmm. Larry, before you answer that, I just want to jump, because we have another question that came in that I think would be really apt to pose, and we're just about at the Q&A part of this. And so someone raised the question of what are the specific measures that need to be taken to restructure and change the primary system in light of social media and other digital technologies that aim to alter voters' perspectives?
As I said, I think one thing we need to do is to increase, well, let me start again. One thing we need to do is have a debate about primaries. You've got Donald Trump, you've got Bernie Sanders arguing this is the voice of the people, and that's just, it's wrong. The primary is a deformation of our democracy. It's the source of many of the problems we're talking about, or at least a contributor to them. So I think we need to focus on that. As I said, I think we need to improve the peer review. It doesn't need to be huge. It needs to be enough so that a losing candidate who has enough delegates and thinks they can build a coalition could turn to those unpledged delegates, super delegates, and have some chance of blocking a Donald Trump-like candidate. Donald Trump is the front runner for the Republican Party nomination. That is a real possibility. He's certainly the best organized and best funded at this point, and we will have more. We have a whole bunch of Secretary of States running that are little Trumpers. So this is a real problem. We've got to deal with that right away. And I think taking a look at the peer review element is something to do. Secondly, as Judd has been saying, I think very eloquently, we need to take much more seriously the institutions of our democracy. It's not a space that political scientists go to. Most journalism writing from the Times and the Post tends to be very one-sided. It's Republicans are blowing up our democracy. Well, Democrats are at it too. They're not the only ones. And we need to have a nonpartisan look, a kind of an assessment of our democracy in terms of the gearbox.
In terms of the what?
The gearbox. We need to look at the actual mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think we need to be honest about this myth we have that elections equal democracy. In my book, we spent a lot of time, and we got to over 500,000 offices at the municipal, local, state, federal level that have elections. People are exhausted. And if you look abroad, the number is like, in Germany, it's about a dozen or less over a number of years. Britain, it's a little bit more. And when you've got people voting in so many elections, they are dissipated. The kind of engagement that Harry's talking about, it's really hard to mobilize for most elections. And the result is people are tuning out, they're just showing up, or they're just skipping it. And so we need to do an audit of our elections and decide which ones really matter. We need to have fewer decisive elections. So that would be my response. But I would say, again, the number one thing is we need to have an honest, forceful debate about what we mean by democracy and scrutinize primaries. They are not democratic. They are the source. They are the avenue by which Donald Trump, before Donald Trump, George Wallace, almost made it through the gate. We've got to do what other countries do.
Lee.
Well, let me keep the conversation going and say, Larry, I totally agree with you. Primaries are terrible. We should absolutely get rid of them. But I would note that if we get rid of primaries within the existing two-party system, what it will mean is that voters in 90% of the country, there's no election. I mean, it's just whatever an even smaller cabal of interested elites chooses will go for. So I think if you had proportional multi-party elections, then it would be very easy to say we can get rid of primaries because now people have a meaningful choice where their vote actually matters. So, and I also agree with you, we have way too many local elections, right? I mean, there's way too many elections and way too little choice. I'd like to see fewer elections, but more meaningful choices. I think that's the direction in which we should go. I wish I shared your optimism, Larry, and Judd as well. But when I look at the 2020 election, I look at the January 6th riot, I look at the Republican response to the January 6th riot, I look at how Republican candidates across the country are falling over themselves to say how they're going to prevent Democrats from winning the next election. I look at the number of voters who say that violence can be justified. And I look at what happens in other countries that are, as Dr. Jennifer McCoy has described, as perniciously polarized. And I don't see a lot of cause for optimism. This is not a cold. And we need to take it seriously. And I agree we should be investing more in elections administration. I think that's incredibly important. But we've got to think this is a moment in which the old order is collapsing. The age of neoliberalism is over. The Republican Party is careening and transforming. Democratic Party is careening and transforming. We're in a moment of generational transformation. And there are real problems of inequality in this country. There are real problems that we have to deal with on decarbonizing our economy. There's a tremendous immigration crisis. And just because Congress passed an Affordable Care Act, however many years ago, doesn't mean that healthcare costs aren't continuing to skyrocket, and a lot of people are still struggling to get adequate care, even if they have insurance.
So I think that there's another point to this when we're talking about institutions and institutional reform. The fact that Donald Trump is a front runner to potentially get the nomination for the Republican Party brings us back to, and that so many people thought that he was unfit at one point or another. It brings back one of the institutional immunity elements or kind of immune self-defense that's supposed to operate within the system, and that being impeachment. But this person was impeached twice and convicted neither time, and has kind of marched on to the road of political viability. I guess the question I have is, for all of the optimism that we can muster, if the protective mechanisms that were already in the system have proven so ineffective, is it reasonable that we're going to actually see new ones enacted in the moment that we're in right now? Larry, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I think, it's a really good question. And I think we all share, concerns about where we are. But, just take my approach about looking at reforming the direct primary. You had 58% of Congress voting to overturn the certified election results in 2020. 58%, 70% in the House. Now, why is that happening? Because every single one of those members of Congress and senators were looking ahead to the primary. And they knew, as Liz Cheney is experiencing, they would be primaried if they didn't abide by the Trumpist line. So yes, I think the institutions of our impeachment could work, but we've got to go back to square one and say, who's being nominated? Where's the check on demagogues being allowed through the gate? That used to be, a primary concern going back to Madison and Robert Crowley and many others. And I think it's just an irresponsibility with regards to institutional design. We need durable procedures and rules that can help us weed out the threats to our Constitution.
Judd, I have a question that's come in for you. It says, can Mr. Choate please review the necessity for, quote, routinely clearing, end quote, the voting rolls? Is there a legit reason to do this, or is it just a way to suppress votes?
Yeah, this is a real misunderstanding that people have about the way elections administration works. Of course, every state has their own mechanism, their own laws, and the ways in which those operate. But pretty much every state operates similarly. And that is that when somebody's eligible, they receive a ballot, or in like a vote by mail state like ours, or they are eligible to come in and vote in person in an in-person state. And if they are not eligible, or they don't live there anymore, they have moved and are no longer eligible, they are not going to receive a ballot in the mail. They are not going to be able to vote in person, except in a same-day registration state where you might be able to update your voter registration. There are not hundreds of thousands of ineligible voters on voter rolls, and there are not purges to remove people who are eligible on voter rolls. That's just not the way that federal law works. It's not the way that state law works. This is a sort of fiction that one or the other side has sort of foisted upon elections administration. I get up every day trying to make sure that everybody who's eligible is on the list and everybody who's not eligible is not on the list. And pretty much everybody works that same way. They may have crummy laws in some states that they have to work around, but for the most part, the elections administrators are able to do that.
So Judd, I have to tell you, we did this work at Columbia. We had the Columbia Journalism Investigations team that looked into this. And we did in fact find that there were people being purged, and they were disproportionately likely to be Black, or disproportionately likely to be people of color. Yeah. And the ACLU found that in Georgia in, I think it was 2018. And so yeah. I don't think it's factually accurate to say that the voter rolls have not been used in ways that curate the electorate in particular ways.
This is largely, again, about the difference in the way the laws are written. So the Georgia law that you're describing was that exact match law. And that's just a lousy law. And frankly, shouldn't have been the way in which they did their matching to identify voters. The other problem that many jurisdictions face about the cancellation of voters, so we don't use the word purge, but that's basically what we're talking about, is, and the way that works in practice is that African-American voters and Hispanic voters are more likely to vote on presidential years only, as opposed to white voters, especially white older voters, who vote in every election. And so if a Hispanic or Black voter who only votes periodically fails to vote in that once every 4 years cycle, then they are subject to cancellation at a much higher rate than those white voters who are voting in every one of those elections. It's not a function of an elections administrator doing something, it's a bad law. And the law sort of dictates that you do something with that voter when, frankly, under a normal circumstance or a better written law, you wouldn't.
Yeah, I don't want us to turn this into a minute ongoing debate. That's not what we found when we looked at this, but I want us to move on to the next question. So, and this I think is a really important question. Do any of the panelists have concrete suggestions for the kind of work is most helpful to citizens, most helpful for citizens to do if they're interested in trying to promote democracy and voting rights? Oh, Hahrie.
Yeah, I can chime in on that. So, let me, I think the kind of, I think the first thing we have to do is that to accept is that not all forms of engagement are the same. And I think one mistake that a lot of people make in thinking about different ways for ordinary people to get involved is to draw an equivalency between the sort of many array of options that we see. And I think one of the things that we learn is that the kind of opportunities that you want are opportunities in which people are actually able to engage in the work of doing everyday democracy, right? It's like in building relationships with each other, learning to build coalitions, learning how to negotiate for power over the kind of outcomes that we want. And I feel like one of the big challenges that we saw is that the opportunities for people to do that have really declined over time. And I think that's a function both of the points that Lee is making, which is that our political parties aren't providing those kinds of opportunities as much as they have, but also that we don't see that in civil society. So I think that, if people want to get involved, there are a ton of organizations out there that are trying to get people engaged in voting rights, but what are the organizations that are giving people the opportunity to do that is more than just expressing their anger about it? That most of the opportunities that people have to get involved are signing petitions, donating money, essentially kind of reacting to the choices that someone in DC most likely has set up for you to react to. And the kind of opportunities that we see that actually make a difference in shaping people's ability to engage in their communities are not the ones that are crafted by professional nonprofit organizers in DC, but instead by people that are actually embedded in work in their communities. And so one, I think little bits of data around this is, there's some other political scientists that have done some research that found, the turn of the 20th century, right? So when in the early 1900s, excuse me, there were 46 civil society organizations that claimed 1% or more of the adult population as dues-paying members. And now in the 21st century, we probably have one that I can think of, that probably meets that. And what that means is that our civil society is fractured into so many small organizations in which people are just doing that work of expressing outrage without actually doing the work of the hard work of getting involved in ways that can actually make a difference. And I think the answer to the question is rethinking the kind of opportunities that we offer for people. I think part of that is the work of the political parties, but part of that is also the work of these civil society organizations.
Hahrie, if I were to guess, would that one organization be the AARP?
Yep, I'll just say I haven't seen systematic data on this, but that's the only organization that I know of that has more. So 1% of the adult population in the US is approximately 2.6 million people. I don't know of any organization that has more than that. And the thing about the AARP, by the way, is you can join now as soon as you turn 35, right? So they've
joined at 35?
Yeah, so for us, all of us, I don't know, our de facto can be members of that. And so, part of what they've done is they've expanded the ability for getting people to able to get involved.
I feel better about this because when I turned 50, I got a lot of AARP mail, and that just made me not feel good. But that's neither here nor there. I won't drag you all into my own existential crisis. We have another question, which is kind of a question comment, but it says, if Congress needs to go to work on elections reform, which they failed to do in the past 18 months with very slim margins in the House and Senate, what is the likelihood of any reform happening after the November elections if Republicans take back both?
Probably zero. Maybe there'll be something around the Electoral Count Act, but I wouldn't hold my breath on that.
Mm-hmm.
The Republican Party is not interested in the federal government playing any role in elections. They clearly want to allow the states that they control to make changes that make it harder for Black and brown communities to vote, to make it harder for younger people to vote, and for Democratic constituencies to vote, and to give more power to state legislatures to overrule secretaries of state who might not agree that Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis should be the next president. It seems pretty clear to me.
And Larry's just pointed out that he talks about the kind of responses because we have 3 minutes left. So some of the questions fall under categories that Larry addresses in his book, Democracy Under Fire, Donald Trump and the Breaking of American History. We have one question, which I think we'll be able to get in just under the wire, which is, how do we keep voters sufficiently educated so they recognize their own interests and vote their own interests? Judd.
Hey, so the federal government's been helping us with this. So over the last couple of years, we've received Help America Vote Act money in 3 different tranches. We just got one in the last budget reconciliation bill. For Colorado, that's going to be $1.4 million once we add the percentage that we provide at the state level. And we're going to dedicate a lot of that money to election outreach, election education, trying to remind people, how do you vote? How do you register to vote? What are the mechanisms by which you convey that choice? And then use some of the money to improve the foundation of our election system, like improving our auditing, improving our ability to respond to social media and so forth. So there are ways in which elections administrators actually do have access to funds that can do that work.
And Lee, I'll give you the last comment. We can do it in 30 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, I think this question of how do voters figure out their own interests is a question that assumes that voters are this reified, entity, whereas in really what should be the strength of America is the diversity and pluralism of this country, in which there are many different perspectives and many different views. And the challenge is that our parties don't allow for that diversity and don't represent that diversity. Instead, there's 2 bifurcated, separated echo chambers in which people are told that the other side is fundamentally anti-American, and particularly on the political right, there is an extreme liberal view that has taken over about a stolen election that is undermining the fundamental faith in our electoral system. And that's why I think I'm justified in using the word doom at this moment.
And so I also want to just last minute here mention that there's so many questions that we did not get to, but you would do well to take a look at Hahrie Hahn's book, which is Prisms of the People, Power and Organizing in 21st Century America, and also Lee Drutman's book, Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, The Case for Multi-Party Democracy in America, which I read and we actually had extensive dialogue about and found to be very thoughtful and provocative. I want to thank everyone for their insights, everyone for their commentary, everyone for their time. Thank you. I think we have illustrated, the broad range of ideas and thinking around these very questions, and we're happy to have been able to do that with you.
Thank you, Jelani.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.